They said it was the coldest night in 30 years in Detroit. But for a child with no home, no family, nowhere to go, that number didn't mean a thing. June Whitaker, 7 years old, was curled up in the corner of a dark alley tucked behind an abandoned building off Linwood Street. She pressed herself against the freezing brick wall, the wind howling in her ears like a lost soul crying out. Over her shoulders was a frayed quilt, stained and dirty, but clutched tightly like it was the last treasure she had in the world. A single J was hand-stitched into one corner, the thread thin, a little crooked, but still clear. Her mother had sewn it in on her birthday, just 1 week before that fateful night. The night the apartment caught fire, the night her parents didn't make it out, the night someone pushed her out the window. She survived, but had nowhere left to call home. June curled up like a shadow in the biting cold. Her breath turned to a thin mist in the air, vanishing as quickly as the memory of her mother's arms. She didn't cry, didn't shiver, didn't fight. She just existed. Then something strange broke the silence. A breath, rough, rapid, not the wind, not the usual hiss from a leaky pipe. June looked up, eyes squinting into the darkest part of the alley. Lying still in the thin layer of snow on the ground was a large shape, a dog, more specifically a German shepherd. Big, shaggy, its fur matted in dirty clumps, its ribs showed through its skin, a clear sign it hadn't eaten in days. Its breath came in weak, uneven bursts. June slowly stood. She didn't move closer, didn't back away, just watched. The dog did the same, no growl, no movement, just opened a look straight into hers. Deep brown, aged, almost human. For a moment, there was no snow, no wind, no cold. Just 2 pairs of eyes, one from a child left behind, one from a creature that had once been someone, once meant something, staring at each other in silence. No words were spoken, but they both understood. Tonight, without each other, might be the end. June took 1 step forward, then stopped. The cold felt like it had frozen her feet in place, but those eyes, that gaze made it impossible to turn away. The dog didn't move. Maybe it was too weak. Maybe it was watching, like a soldier trained to stay alert even while dying. Its fur, under the snow and soot, was a strange burned gray. Not white, not black, more like ash. Ash, she whispered in her mind, then gave a small nod, like the name had already been decided. Ash. June knelt down. She slipped the blanket off her shoulders, the only warmth she had left, and crouched beside the dog. Hesitating, she gently draped one end over Ash's bony back. The dog's fur was rough and matted. Its body was nearly cold, but the breath, it was still there, faint, dragging on, like it was holding on to the world by the thinnest thread. June lay down beside it, not touching, just curling up at the edge of the blanket. The wind kept howling, but something had changed. Like in the middle of this brutal cold, a tiny pocket of warmth had quietly begun to grow. By morning, the first light slipped through the cracks in the rotting wall. Dust floated in the air, catching the sun in soft streaks like mist. June opened her eyes. Her body was sore, stiff, but not as cold as usual. The first thing she felt was steady breathing near her ear. The second was the weight of a large body wrapped around her. Ash had moved during the night. No one could say how. Not with a body that weak, but the dog was now curled around the girl, its head resting near her face, its body shielding her back from the chill of the brick wall. The blanket had shifted, half covering Ash, half covering June. Neither took it all. June didn't move, she just looked. For the first time in a long time, something wasn't just alive, it had chosen to stay with her. Somewhere deep in the remnants of old instinct, Ash knew it had done something unusual. Its body ached from the inside out, stomach empty, back sore, chest heavy like stone. But that look from last night, the look from a tiny, exhausted creature who wasn't afraid of it, had sparked a sliver of something long buried. Protection. No one knew how it managed to crawl that close to the girl. Even less clear was why it wrapped itself around her like that. But when its head rested next to her face and her breathing synced with its own, Ash knew it couldn't not be there. It had once been trained to do exactly this. Stay close, stand guard, no sleep, no retreat. But this time there were no commands, no handler. Just a strange, deeply familiar feeling. This is right. This is where I'm meant to be. Since that fateful night, the night fire and smoke swallowed everything, Ash had walked for miles without knowing why, couldn't remember its name, its job, or who used to call it good boy. All that remained was pain and the instinct to survive. But last night, when it saw the girl shivering in the alley, that survival instinct hit a wall. Something was different. Not prey, not a threat, one of its own. A small creature, lost too, carrying the same scent of ash and grief. Also fighting alone against the cold indifference of this city. Ash didn't understand the concept of empathy, but when it lay down beside her, under that worn-out quilt, it felt something it hadn't felt in weeks. Purpose. And in its restless sleep, between the wind's howl and the distant hum of cars, Ash dreamed of an old voice. Someone who once stroked its head, once said, "Stay with the girl. Watch over her." It didn't know where the voice came from, but it remembered hearing it, and it obeyed. June sat up. Ash opened its eyes too, slowly but without any sign of alarm. They looked at each other. No good morning, no promises. There was only a quiet agreement between two wounded souls, now choosing to stand beside each other. She pulled the blanket in tighter, wrapping it around both of them. For the first time, June felt someone beside her, not out of pity, not out of duty, but simply because they wanted to stay. June never told anyone about that night. Not because she forgot, but because she remembered too well. So well that all it took was closing her eyes, and the whole room came rushing back. The blaring fire alarm, the thick smoke, her mother's scream, the heat searing her skin, and a sudden push from behind. That old apartment, 3rd floor, in a row of red brick buildings near Jefferson. She used to think it was ugly. Peeling walls, creaky wood floors. But now, if she could trade everything just to go back there for one more night, she would. My family wasn't anything special. Dad fixed air conditioners, Mom worked the night shift at a laundromat. Every evening, I ate canned noodles and watched old cartoons Mom had recorded for me. On my 7th birthday, Mom gave me a small blue box. Inside was a little quilt with a crooked hand-stitched J in the corner. "To keep your dreams warm," she smiled. A week later, they were gone. The police said it was an electrical fire. Spread fast, rotting wood, no time to escape. The whole building was up in flames in minutes. No one understood how June survived. The firefighters found her on the fire escape, coughing, eyes wide in shock. She didn't know how she got out there. She only remembered a push, a hand, or maybe something that wasn't a hand at all. She wasn't sure, and no one asked after that. 3 weeks later, she was placed in foster care. The Grants, her temporary family, lived in the western suburbs. They had 5 other kids, cheap dinners, and one rule: children should be quiet. At first, June tried. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't react. But silence didn't protect her from the pinches, the sudden slaps when she spilled water, or the closet door that locked from the outside whenever she was too much. They said she was traumatized, doesn't listen. They didn't talk about the nightmares, or the screaming that woke the house, or the way she bit her own hand to wake herself up. 2 months later, on a rainy night, June slipped out through the 1st-floor window. The quilt her mom gave her was the only thing she took, and from that moment on, she never looked back. Now, in a snow-covered alley, June sat close beside Ash, arms wrapped around the old blanket, eyes on the dog as it dozed with half-closed lids. There was something in the way Ash shifted, in the way it reacted to strange noises outside the alley, that made June question things. This wasn't just some stray. It didn't flinch at sirens, didn't bark without reason, didn't back away when people passed by. It assessed. A drunk man had wandered past the mouth of the alley the night before. June didn't see him, but Ash perked up, ears alert, head raised, a short breath out. Then it lay back down, eyes still slightly open, like it was standing guard. Another time, when a police cruiser rolled by, Ash suddenly sat up, back straight, head lifted, like a trained reflex. But it didn't bark, didn't react aggressively. It looked more like it was remembering a command it used to know by heart. June started paying closer attention. Around Ash's neck was a faint callus, the kind left behind by wearing a collar for a long time. The fur across its chest had small, evenly spaced bald patches, marks left by a vest or harness. Its eyes weren't cloudy like an old dog's, but they didn't shine like a puppy's either. They were deep, worn, like they'd seen too much. June had lived long enough to know exactly what that kind of look meant. Ash wasn't just some abandoned animal. It had once had a role, a purpose. Maybe it served someone. Maybe it had been a working dog. June wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. Both she and Ash had once belonged somewhere, and both had been robbed of that in ways that were anything but fair. Detroit moved into the heart of winter like it was unloading its final rage on the city. Every morning, the streets were covered in mist, and the cold sank under your skin, no matter how many layers you wore. For June and Ash, every day was a fight to survive. But at least now, they weren't doing it alone. After a week of wandering together, the two of them had settled into something close to a rhythm. Not a life, exactly, but a shared instinct for survival. Ash always walked on the right, close to the curb, the side where people were most likely to approach. Its back leaned slightly, gait steady, eyes scanning ahead. Every time someone came near, Ash would slow down by half a step, just enough to position itself between them and June. She didn't train it, didn't signal. It just knew. When June sat down on a patch of sidewalk near a bus stop, Ash lay beside her, resting its head on her leg. If anyone paused nearby, one look from the dog was enough to make them hesitate for a few extra seconds. One morning, when the cold eased just a little, June decided to try singing again. She couldn't remember what her voice sounded like. It had been months since she last used it, but in her head, the melody of an old song still played, one her dad used to strum on the guitar every night. "You Are My Sunshine." Her voice came out soft, quiet, a little shaky, but clear and warm. Ash lifted its head at the sound. Didn't bark, didn't move away. Just sat up and looked around, like it was checking to see if anyone was listening. A middle-aged woman stopped, then another person. No one said anything, but a few small bills were dropped into the paper cup in front of her. Ash, like it understood, sat up straighter, eyes scanning each passerby. Once, it even let out a soft whine, not threatening, just enough to make someone glance down, like a silent backup dancer for the lead singer. They became an odd pair in the heart of Detroit, a skinny girl singing with an uneven voice and an old, proud German shepherd always by her side like a loyal bodyguard. They never stayed in one spot too long. Every couple of days, June changed locations, sometimes near the train station, other times in front of an old bookstore where the owner didn't chase them off. Everywhere they went, Ash adjusted. In crowded corners, he sat still like a statue. In quieter spots, he inched closer to June, as if trying to keep her warm. June got used to falling asleep next to Ash each night, no longer jolting awake in panic when sirens wailed in the distance. And Ash, once struggling to breathe with every step, could now stand up without needing to rest right away. Across Woodward Avenue from the second floor of an old cafe, a woman had been watching them, more than once, quietly, without saying a word. She had silver hair tied neatly in a bun, wore a thick knit sweater, and always carried a small notebook. Her name was Mara Green. The first time she really noticed them was when Ash stepped in front of June as a drunk man wandered by. The way the dog lowered its center of gravity, eyes locked on the target, and let out a low hiss instead of a growl, it was too familiar. That wasn't how regular dogs acted. That was a canine. Trained, disciplined. Mara had spent 25 years training police dogs. She'd worked with hundreds like Ash, and never once had she seen a stray keep its reflexes that sharp. But the reason she hadn't approached yet was the girl. That little girl wasn't taking care of a dog. She was sharing life with it, in a way most adults couldn't even manage. Every morning, Mara returned to the same spot, standing behind the foggy cafe window, watching across the street in silence as the strange little pair carried on. She hadn't stepped forward, but something deep in her gut told her this wasn't random. Nighttime in Detroit didn't leave much room for the weak, and the weak, they were the ones people noticed first. That's why June and Ash usually left the busy areas right after sunset. But that day, they stayed a little longer. Maybe because the wind had eased up. Maybe because the day's take had been better than usual. Nearly $20, enough for a hot meal. Maybe soup, maybe a burger. Ash needed food too. She tucked the money into her inner coat pocket, pulled the quilt tighter around her, and turned toward the familiar alley near the bus stop. Ash followed, unaware that across the street 3 figures had quietly broken off down a side path. Eyes locked on the girl. They stepped from the shadows once June was halfway into the alley. 3 young men. Thin, clothes ragged, eyes sunken, from hunger, or maybe something worse. Well, look who made bank today, the first one said, his voice flat, a smirk tugging at his mouth. June instinctively stepped back. Ash immediately moved in front of her, blocking the space between her and the strangers. Watch the dog, the second guy muttered, eyes fixed on Ash. No worries, the third one said, pulling out a small knife. I hate dogs. Ash let out a low growl, back arched, ears rigid. But his body was still thin, weak. He couldn't hold the stance for long. When the man lunged, Ash struck in a blur, jaws clamping down on the knife hand. The man screamed in pain. The sudden attack sent all three into a brief panic, but the second guy recovered fast and landed a brutal kick to Ash's chest, sending him flying across the alley. The crack of impact echoed like breaking bones. Ash! June screamed, rushing to where he lay writhing on the ground. Ash's breathing grew labored. He tried to rise but couldn't. Don't come any closer, June shouted, wrapping herself around Ash's trembling body, placing herself between him and the attackers like a tiny shaking shield. The three froze. Maybe they didn't expect her to scream. Maybe they didn't expect the dog to bite that hard. Maybe they didn't expect an audience. Cops are on the way, a woman's voice called out behind them. Low, firm, and cold. All three turned and saw a silver-haired woman standing tall, phone in hand, the streetlight casting harsh shadows across her timelined face. Her eyes, though, were sharp as blades. Walk away, she said, not moving an inch, before you have to explain why you jumped a kid and killed a dog. They didn't need another warning. The three scattered, slipping into the dark like rats. The woman moved quickly toward June. You okay, sweetheart? June didn't answer. She just held Ash tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line. The woman crouched down slowly, not rushing, not threatening. She reached out and gently placed her hand on Ash's back. The dog didn't flinch, just panted, shallow and fast. Broken ribs, she muttered. If we don't take care of this soon, it could get bad. What's your name? No response. Just frightened eyes. That's all right. You don't have to talk. The woman offered a small nod. My name's Mara. I used to train dogs. Dogs like Ash. June blinked at the name. Mara. This isn't just any dog, Mara said, her eyes shifting to Ash. The reflexes, the stance, the way he attacked, he's been trained. She stood up. Come with me. I can help him. Just a temporary fix, but it'll be a lot better than letting him freeze to death out here. June looked at Ash. The dog struggled to open his eyes, letting out a heavy breath, but there was something in his gaze. Something that looked like agreement. She nodded. For the first time in months, she trusted an adult. Mara didn't say much on the drive home. She just turned up the heat, handed June a towel to wipe her face, and every so often glanced at Ash with a look that was half professional, half personal. When they reached the house, a wooden place in the suburbs with a wide yard and the sound of dogs barking in the distance, Mara lifted Ash onto a table already set up in the garage. I'm not a vet, Mara said as she wrapped the bandages around Ash, but I've handled 100 breaks like this. June stood beside her, eyes locked on every movement. When Ash let out a soft whimper, she reached out and held his front paw. Good job, Mara whispered. It wasn't clear if she meant Ash or the girl. That night, June slept on a small couch by the fireplace. Ash lay curled at her feet, breathing steady, wrapped in the same old quilt. Mara sat in the chair across from them, hands around a mug of hot tea, eyes fixed on the two fragile souls who had just entered her life. She used to think she was past the age for starting over. But as she watched Ash breathing gently and June sleeping without flinching at every sound, she knew. Some bonds aren't meant to be explained, only believed. 2 days after the kick that nearly ended him, Ash still lay quietly at the foot of the sofa, shifting only to breathe or flick an eye open. June barely left his side for more than a minute. Mara had braced herself for worse. But this dog, worn down as he looked, was tougher than any she'd ever worked with. There's something strange about this, Mara muttered, pouring clean water into Ash's bowl. No stray survives injuries like that. The next morning, she took both of them to a trusted vet clinic out in the suburbs. June didn't say a word the entire ride. It wasn't fear that kept June silent. It was that she simply couldn't speak. Mara had asked gently a few times before, but all she ever got was a quiet shake of the head and eyes cast downward. No resistance, no avoidance. Just silence. While the vet examined Ash, Mara stayed close, holding his head steady. June stood farther back, clutching the quilt with the faded J in the corner. "You know this dog from before?" the vet asked. "No," Mara replied, eyes locked on every movement. "But I'm pretty sure he was trained, possibly a service dog. Canine, maybe." The vet nodded, gently parting the fur around Ash's chest. "Old scarring here, very uniform, could be surgical, and on the back leg, a fracture that healed but slightly misaligned." "Strays don't survive injuries like that," Mara said firmly. The vet nodded again, then reached for the microchip scanner. "Maybe there's still data on it," the vet said, sliding the scanner along Ash's neck. A soft beep sounded. There was a signal. But error. "Partially damaged," she muttered, frowning at the screen. "Not a standard pet chip. Older, stronger signal, more like military grade." An hour later, with help from an old friend who used to work at the K-9 division of the fire department, Mara got a partial data dump from the damaged chip. Just a few digits, but enough to trace through the archived system. When the screen lit up with the result, Mara froze. The coffee cup in her hand trembled slightly. Registered name Ranger Unit, Special Rescue Team, Detroit Fire Department. Training, search and rescue in collapsed structures. Status missing, 9 months ago during the Holden Street building collapse. Ranger. Mara took a slow breath, her hand resting gently on Ash's back. The dog breathed steadily, unaware that his name, Ranger, had just been spoken for the first time in nearly a year. She remembered now, the Holden Street collapse, a massive fire that brought down the central stairwell. 4 people dead. Several rescued thanks to the K-9 unit. But one dog never came back. The papers had mentioned it briefly. One dog presumed lost in the line of duty. But there hadn't been much more. No recovered body. Just silence. Now Mara knew why. Ranger hadn't died. He'd been trapped, and somehow made it out. Or maybe someone had pushed him out. And if that night was when Ranger disappeared, it lined up exactly with the night June escaped her own fire. Mara turned toward her. June sat curled up on the waiting room bench, eyes fixed on Ranger, still unaware of his name, still unaware of the weight he carried. "June," Mara said softly. The girl looked up. It was the first time Mara had called her by name, the name she'd guessed from the stitched J on the blanket. "This dog," Mara said slowly, "he's not just any dog." June didn't move. "Did you know? His name is Ranger. He used to be a rescue dog, a hero." A faint blink, almost too small to notice. "Ranger went missing in a fire, 9 months ago." Mara's eyes held hers. "The same night you—" June looked down. Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. Mara didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. She knew June understood, and she knew June remembered. That night, in the quiet wooden house tucked away in the suburbs, Mara sat at her desk writing in her notebook. Name, Ranger. Traits, loyal, precise reflexes, high pain tolerance. Behavior, bonds easily with the wounded. Current condition, recovering. Notes, memories may not have fully returned, but instinct, that never left. In the living room, June lay curled on the sofa, still clutching her old quilt. Her eyes never left Ranger. For the first time, June reached out and ran her hand gently along Ranger's neck. The first time she had willingly touched anyone since leaving foster care. Ranger shifted slightly, then leaned his head into her hand, as if to say, "I'm still here, and I remember you, even if I don't know why." The little room was filled with late afternoon sunlight. The light hit the walls lined with framed certificates, proof of the life Mara Green had once lived, and everything she'd given to it. June sat quietly beside Ranger, her hand brushing over the fur just beginning to grow back where the injury had been. At the desk, Mara flipped through old case files, her eyes scanning the faded print on each page. "The Holden Street fire," she murmured. "February 12th. Her hand stopped. It was the same day, the day June's family was lost. Mara slowly turned her head. June was still silent, but something in her gaze, locked on Ranger, suddenly froze. A flicker crossed her face. Shock. Then recognition. June placed her hand on Ranger's neck. She leaned forward, whispering, not quite to Mara, not quite to herself. "It was him. He saved me that night." Mara held her breath. June looked up. Her voice was still soft but steady, solid. "It was Ash, Ranger. He's the one who pushed me out the window." And just like that, the memory cracked open, like glass giving way under the weight of truth. June saw it all again. The room filling with smoke, her mother screaming from somewhere down the hall, the ceiling starting to groan and give. And through the chaos, a large shape barreling through the doorway. Bright brown eyes, teeth gripping the edge of her quilt, tugging, dragging her toward the window. She hadn't known what it was then. Hadn't known who it was. But now, as she looked at Ranger, at Ash, it all came into focus, sharp and undeniable, like it had never been forgotten. He had saved her. He had been the one. Ranger. 3 days later, Detroit was hit with an odd, dry wind in the middle of winter. No snow, no rain, just gusts that kicked up layers of dust. Mara was in the back training area, working with 2 aging dogs. June and Ranger were in the utility shed, getting meals ready. She didn't know who had flipped the breaker in the old storage room, the one filled with flammable materials. She didn't see the spark catch on the rotted curtain. All she knew was the sound, a sharp, contained pop. Then the smell. Smoke. The fire spread fast. Too fast, unreasonably fast. "Ranger, June!" Mara shouted, tearing toward the main shed as thick smoke began to rise in swirling, suffocating waves. June was helping Ranger through the doorway when the explosion ripped through the left side of the property. Flames erupted from the secondary kennel, where Toby and Ella, the 2 old dogs, were resting. June turned. Mara screamed, "No, it's too dangerous." But June had already run. No hesitation. No second thought. Exactly the way Ash, Ranger, had once charged into that burning apartment for her. Ranger let out a long, aching howl. Even still weak, he tried to stand, took a few shaky steps toward the fire, and collapsed. Mara held him tight, tears welling as June's figure vanished into the sea of smoke. Everything after that was chaos. Shouts from the firefighters, sirens screaming, voices crackling over radios. But no one dared enter the section that had begun to collapse. Mara stood outside, fists clenched so tight her knuckles split and bled. Ranger trembled at her feet, letting out soft, broken whines, like he was calling June's name again and again and couldn't understand why she wasn't answering. 1 minute, then 2, then 5. No one came out. Then, the shatter of glass. A door burst open. A small figure stumbled through the smoke and flame. A quilt covered in ash draped over her shoulders. In her hands, Toby and Ella, the 2 old dogs, dragging behind her on torn cloth straps. And just behind her, it was Ash, Ranger. He had gotten up. He had followed her into the fire. June collapsed the moment she crossed the threshold. No one was close enough to catch her. All 3, June, Toby, and Ella, fell to the charred grass near the porch. Ranger stumbled forward, limping, coughing through the smoke. He dropped beside her, body shaking, and pressed himself close. June didn't open her eyes, but her lips moved, just enough to whisper, "Ash saved me first. This time, I saved him." When the ambulance arrived, they were met with a scene that left everyone silent. A 7-year-old girl lying in a scorched yard, covered in ash, arms wrapped around a massive German shepherd, gasping for breath. 2 beings who had once survived a fire, who had once saved each other, and now had done it again. That night, the entire city knew the name June Whittaker. News outlets ran the headline, "Girl runs into fire to save dog," a story of courage and friendship across 2 fires. But for Mara, sitting beside June's hospital bed, her hand wrapped gently around the girl's, with Ranger curled up beneath them, all she could think was, "Some meetings aren't fate. They're led by the heart." A day after the fire, in a small vet clinic on the edge of town, June sat on a wooden bench, her hand wrapped tightly around Ash's front paw. The dog lay on a soft mat, eyes half closed, chest wrapped in thick bandages, but each breath still came, steady and slow. He was alive, but he wasn't okay. The fall as he escaped the fire had worsened the already broken ribs, and when the vet examined more closely, they found something else, a hairline fracture in the spine. An old injury, once healed, now compromised again. "We can operate," the vet said, his tone heavy. "But the cost will be high, at least $8,000. Spinal work, deep anesthesia, specialized recovery." Mara looked down at her calloused hands. She'd had money once. Back when she was a lead canine trainer, the pay was solid, enough to fix up the house, buy a used car, live without worry. But since retirement, since dedicating her time to old dogs and then taking June in, the savings had nearly disappeared. June didn't say a word, but she knew. She understood that look in Mara's eyes, the weight behind the silence after the vet left the room. Ash needed surgery to survive, but how could they possibly afford it? That night, while Mara was washing bowls for the dogs in the kitchen, June quietly placed a piece of paper in front of her. One sentence, written in pencil block letters, "We can ask for help." Mara looked up. June pointed to the phone on the table, then mimed filming, a camera gesture with her small hands. Her eyes weren't begging, they weren't desperate, they were determined. Mara stared at her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "All right," she said, "we'll tell Ash's story, your story, but we'll do it the right way." The next morning they began filming. Nothing fancy, no background music, no slick editing, just Mara, voice a little shaky, telling the world, "This is Ash, a German shepherd who used to be a rescue dog, who once pulled a little girl from a burning building. 9 months later, that same girl ran back into a fire to save him." Then came the images. June holding Ash in the recovery room, old street footage of her singing on the sidewalk, Ash lying loyally beside her, and that haunting shot after the fire, the little girl sitting in a scorched yard, arms wrapped around the dog in a sea of ash. At the end of the video, Mara looked directly into the camera. "Ash needs surgery to stay alive. We can't afford it. But we believe, if enough people come together, we can save him one more time." Within 12 hours of posting, the video exploded online. A major TikTok account reposted it, adding the caption, "The girl and the dog who saved each other, twice." Twitter lit up with the hashtag #SaveAsh. Instagram flooded with fan art, drawings inspired by that now iconic photo. A soot-covered girl, a battered dog, and a blanket between them like a shared past and a shared future. "She doesn't speak," one comment read, "but she ran into fire to save the dog who once saved her. This isn't just friendship, this is pure humanity." In just 2 days, the online fundraiser hit $5,000. By day 3, a local news station aired a segment. The bond between a once-mute girl and a retired rescue dog is moving an entire city. On day 5, a national television crew arrived at Mara's home. They filmed the moment June stepped into the yard, Ash walking slowly behind her, still limping, but walking. Mara sat down for the interview and said, "I used to think I'd lived long enough to never be surprised by courage, but when I saw that girl run into the fire like a soldier, I realized there are things I still don't fully understand." That day, the donations passed $10,000. More than enough for the surgery. Enough for the best recovery care Ash could ever get. June still didn't say much, but when she heard the news, she wrapped her arms around Ash, buried her face in his ash-gray fur, and whispered, "We did it, Ash. You're gonna be okay." Mara sat by the window, watching as June slowly walked Ash through the yard, sunlight dancing across the grass. She knew then, miracles didn't always fall from the sky in bursts of light. Sometimes a miracle was belief. Real, quiet belief. The kind that moved thousands of strangers to reach out and save a single life. Just when it felt like everything was finally turning around, the storm came again. On a cool April morning, just after Ash had finished his final pre-surgery checkup, a van from social services pulled up in front of Mara's home. A woman in a button-up shirt, ID badge swinging from her neck, stepped out of the van. 2 police officers followed behind her, flanking her like a formality that didn't need explanation. "Mara Green?" the woman asked, voice flat. "We've received a report about a minor named June Whitaker residing illegally at this address. She needs to be returned to the care system." June instinctively stepped back. Ash immediately pushed in front of her. Mara stepped between them, arms out. "She's not going anywhere," Mara said. Steady but firm. "She's safe here. She's being cared for, and I intend to apply for legal guardianship." The woman didn't argue. She simply handed over a stamped document, an official notice of administrative custody. "If you can't provide legal proof of guardianship," she said, "the girl is still under the system's jurisdiction." June gripped Mara's hand, tight. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes said it all. "I don't want to go. Please, don't let them take me." Mara didn't hesitate. The very next morning, she filed for emergency guardianship at the county courthouse. She didn't have much to present, just her word, a few medical notes, and a printed article about the viral campaign that saved Ash. But to Mara, that wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed the truth. While digging through old files to prepare her court documents, Mara opened a wooden drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small box, filled with fading photos, handwritten letters, and forgotten trinkets whose meaning had long slipped away. One photo slid out. Mara froze. It showed two young women standing in front of an old house in Ohio. One of them, unmistakably Mara herself, aged 36. The other, auburn hair, a radiant face, a smile that struck like memory breaking through fog. In her arms, wrapped in a thin blue blanket, was a newborn baby. Scrawled in pen in the corner of the photo, Kathy and baby Jay, that spring. Mara's heart skipped. Catherine Green, her younger sister. They'd once been inseparable until a long, bitter argument tore them apart. Kathy left and cut contact. 18 years passed with silence until Mara learned Kathy had died in a fire. And baby Jay was June. Mara immediately filed a petition for a DNA test and added the photo, along with hospital records, to her court documents. 2 weeks later, the results came back. No doubt, June was Mara's biological niece. The hearing took place on a quiet Thursday morning, light rain brushing the courthouse windows. June sat curled behind Mara, small and still. Ash lay at her feet, not yet fully healed from surgery but steady present. The social services representative held firm. While the circumstances are moving, raising a child requires clear legal authority. Mara's attorney said nothing, just handed the judge a folder. Inside, the old photograph, a birth certificate reading June Whitaker, mother Catherine Green, and the DNA match. The judge flipped through each page slowly, then nodded. The blood relationship is confirmed. The previous legal guardian is deceased. The child now has a stable residence, a caregiver with a clean record, and overwhelming support from the community, the judge said, his voice calm but firm. He looked toward Mara. Mrs. Green, are you willing to become the legal guardian of this child? Mara reached for June's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. I've been ready, she said, voice catching, since the day she walked into my home. At the end of the hearing, June didn't speak, but as they stepped out of the courtroom, she reached out and took Mara's hand, tight, like a child clinging to her mother on her very first day facing the world. Ash followed close behind, still limping slightly, but eyes clear and full of light. A new kind of family, quiet, imperfect by traditional standards, but bound together by trust, sacrifice, and the shared memory of walking through fire. Behind the training center, on a small field blanketed in soft green grass, dogs of every size and color moved gently beside children. Each shaky step, each hesitant smile, was met with a wagging tail, a soft gaze, a patient lick on a small hand. In the middle of the yard, June stood still, her hand resting gently on Ash's back. She was 8 now, her face no longer pale like it was that first day, her eyes still deep but brighter, holding both the weight of old loss and the quiet spark of something new. Life. Mara called it a year of healing. Since the court hearing, everything began again. Slowly, but surely. June started speaking again, word by word, like she was unlocking a door that had long been bolted shut deep inside her. Ash healed after surgery. He no longer limped. His fur grew back thick and soft, like Ash had never touched him. Mara renovated the training center. She opened a new section for kids who'd been through trauma, who had lost family, who no longer believed in anything. And June became the lead guide in that space, not with lesson plans, but with instinct, with the quiet knowing that only comes from having lived it. One day, an 8-year-old boy arrived, silent, withdrawn, unwilling to touch a single dog. He'd been abandoned too many times. He was convinced that if he loved anything, it would eventually leave. June didn't push. She just sat down, called Ash over. Ash walked over and lay down, just out of arm's reach from the boy. Then, slowly, he inched forward. Every time the boy looked up, Ash paused, waiting, breathing, simply being there. 10 minutes passed. Then a trembling hand reached out and touched the top of Ash's head. And for the first time, the boy cried. Ash had become the living symbol of the center. A German shepherd who had once saved a life, been saved in return, and now was saving others. Not from fire anymore, but from silence. From nightmares, from the fear of being left behind. And June, she was proof that children who'd been broken could still stand, strong, not by forgetting the past, but by learning how to carry it and keep walking anyway. From a distance, Mara watched it all, sometimes still unable to believe what she was seeing. A year ago, she was just a retired woman, living alone with a few aging dogs. Now, she had a niece, and a reason to wake up every morning. That afternoon, June stood in front of the group of kids during a training session. We're keeping it simple today, she said, her voice calm and even. Walk steady, no pulling the leash, and if you get nervous, put your hand on the dog's back. That's how you remember you're not alone. The kids nodded. A few smiled. Ash stepped up beside her, standing tall, his gaze steady. June rested her hand on his back and gave a soft stroke. The wind lifted the edge of her shirt. She turned to the group, her smile quiet but full of certainty. We saved each other. That's what dogs do. They find us when no one else can. Someone once asked, what keeps a child alive after loss? Or, what makes a dog, one who seemed ready to give up, still walk toward the light? The answer isn't magic. It's friendship. It's the connection between two forgotten souls who recognized each other even in the dark. June was once a girl with no words left to speak. Ash was once a dog lost in a city too cold to care. But when they chose to save each other, they rewrote their story. They rewrote fate. We often think we're the ones rescuing animals, but sometimes they're the ones rescuing what's human in us. Ash didn't just find a home, and June didn't just find her voice. They became family. And sometimes, family isn't where we're born. It's who's willing to walk through the fire with us and never leave. If you've ever had a dog who stayed with you through your worst days, drop a comment below. Have you ever been rescued by a four-legged friend? If this story moved you, subscribe to Dog Stories, so you won't miss the next tale of loyalty, kindness, and the kind of friendship that goes beyond words. Because sometimes, it's the smallest things that save someone's life.